inviting me. I'm now quite frightened after Bjorn's presentation to introduce the topic. It made me focus my own position quite a lot. I'm wondering where exactly I stand and thinking perhaps I should rewrite the entire presentation. And somehow it made me think, I used to have a second language. I went to Iran when I was 23, and my parents-in-law didn't speak any English, and I learned Farsi from my mother-in-law, who became my main conversant, and now I've almost lost it. My wife speaks on the phone to my daughter every day in Farsi, and I hear it every single day. But I'm losing it. I'm not able to go to Iran at the moment. I haven't been there for 7 years. When I do go, it takes me a week before it begins to come back, and I have to go out by myself, because everybody I know speaks English. And the question is, what am I losing? Part of trying to answer that question is that just over a year ago, I was invited to an international conference in Venice for teaching Japanese as a foreign language. And almost everybody there was Japanese. And I was given a task that I had to talk about how to disconnect the language from the culture. They said, we don't want you to talk about teaching Japanese means teaching Japanese culture. And so how do you disconnect those? And there was a strong issue, which people were very aware of, which was to escape from racist stereotypes. So, trying to work out what this connection is quite difficult. Recently, I've been using the term decentering, and I'm spelling it in my own way with a capital C, and I'm not quite sure what it means, but let's see if that becomes clear. But this relationship between language and culture, we really have to think about exactly what it means. And interestingly, the way that Bjorn was talking, there were two sides. He was shifting from one place to another. If there was a critical discourse analyst listening to what you were saying, you were talking about two different things. And we'll see where that goes. We should talk about that later. Okay, so global competence. And I put it in inverted commas, because I'm not quite sure what it means. And I was interested to see the definition that you put up. I hadn't seen that before. This is new to me. So I'm trying to come from the bottom up to think about this in purely practical, common sense terms. Imagining that no one had ever thought about intercultural communication before. So if you meet someone from the other side of the world, wherever that is, the other side of the world, it could be my neighbor, who is so different to me that when I talk to him, I feel as I'm talking to someone from the other side of the world. You share an ability to make sense of culture. Given that culture is all around all of us all the time, and it always has been. This isn't this culture or that culture, it's culture by its nature. You are both culturally and linguistically hybrid. And I've been resisting this term hybrid for a long time, but I've come back to it recently. I'll talk about it later. But it means we're all a mixture of different things. And you are both expert in small culture formation on the go. And I'll talk about that more. But all of us, and I see this in my grandchildren, all day long, every single day, they are practicing the nature of culture. And they're doing it in very complex ways. And seeing them sitting at the dinner table with their parents, the politics is incredible. Trying to work out how to behave with other people. This is what I mean by small culture formation on the go. Okay. I was, engineering, good heavens. Well, all right. If you are both engineers, if you both have any sort of common professional background, it should be easier because of professional ethos, which you share, technical knowledge, which you share, conventions, you've got something to talk about. So this should be a huge advantage. Okay. It brings people together. All right. So language then becomes the means for listening and engaging. Language becomes the technology that you have to try to make this sort of thing work. So I'm sort of bringing in language afterwards. I'm not sure if that's the right way around. And what we're trying to do is to find threads. And what I mean by threads is something that connects us. We have to find something that we can connect each other with. And this is a big problem. This morning I was in the lift coming down for breakfast, and in the lift was a Chinese-looking person. I'm getting into big hot water here. Chinese-looking person. He looked at me, and what he thought about me. Okay. I sense we're both middle class. We're both in a hotel looking for breakfast. We're both world travelers. I don't know. Perhaps he's Swedish Chinese and he lives around the corner and always did. Who knows? You've got to be very careful these days. But in my mind, we didn't say a word to each other. But I sensed that we were feeling connected. There were threads already. Now, what gets in the way is that in my background, in my upbringing, there are huge cultural stereotypes about Chinese people. And I've got to push them away, push them away, push them away. I'm wired to think in this us, them. And as soon as you fall into that trap, you're lost. That's what creates the blocks. You've got to find the threads. Okay. But the threads must therefore be free of us, them prejudice. And that is the biggest problem we have as people, especially these days with social media and the politics and all the horrible stuff that's going on. And, Brexit and all that sort of stuff, it's absolutely killing all of us. Prejudice is absolutely everywhere. And this, to me, is what we have to remove. And I think that the prejudice largely comes from grand narratives of nation. Grand narratives are the big stories we're brought up with. We are different to them, we are superior to them, we are inferior to them, and so on. It goes back into history, we think of events, and so on and so on and so forth. This idea of nation, culture, and language bound together in this way is damaging. And these become the blocks that separate us. Okay, blocks and threads. It's just something that I find useful to make sense of things. So, choices about how we approach each other. It could be the ancient us-them narratives of intercultural difference. We are essentially different to each other because of our cultures. Okay, that's the easy thing to go for. Or we could try for the more inclusive narrative of cultural resonance. We are the same people brought up in different circumstances. There's no question that in different countries we have different education systems, different political structures, different structures of all sorts, different media, and this feeds us in ways that make us different to each other. But we're all basically the same people, brought up in different circumstances. And that, to me, is the absolute core principle. And so, I'm in China. I'm going to a conference just like today. I'm picked up by this young guy. First of all, he's probably 30 years younger than me. has a nice car. I get in the car, driving along. Let's have a conversation. Choice. Do I talk to him about Chinese culture and British culture and how different we are? That will create automatic blocks. On the back seat, I see he has some children's toys. It reminds me of my daughter's car. On the back seat, there are children's toys. So I make a choice to talk to him about being a parent. I could damage that choice by talking about the one-child policy and that will bring in the block. So we talk about things that connect us. Okay, he tells me that his parents are very helpful. I got to push that. Chinese stereotype, collectivist society. Nobody thinks for themselves. Parents look after, the grandparents look after the children all the time. Absolute rubbish. Let's not get into that. Okay? My daughter tells me that most of the people who bring kids to school in the morning are grandparents. But nobody says this is British culture. You see? You see how... So then we start talking about what it's like to work in the university. We talk about who is your line manager. How do you manage your life-work relationship? We've got so much to talk about which bring threads. That's the important thing. Okay. So we have to break the us-them expectations and the stories, stories of the cake. I've got to tell you this. This is my note to myself. I was listening to a Chinese PhD student giving a presentation a couple of years ago. Her thesis was about her work. She was in charge of taking business delegations of Chinese people all over the world. They were in the United States. They were visiting a big company. They were sitting down to have a meeting. There were about 4 or 5 Chinese colleagues. Their English wasn't particularly good. The Americans arrived. They put a large cake in the middle of the table. Everybody started looking at each other. The Chinese colleagues were sort of nudging each other, thinking, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? This is American culture we hadn't heard about before. Then suddenly, the ice was broken. And the managing director said, I'm sorry. My mother just told me I had to bring this cake. We never do this normally. And suddenly, everybody burst out laughing. And the thread was created. The illusion was, this is Chinese versus American. Actually, it's just people trying to make sense of what's going on every day. That's the important thing. All right. And another case, table manners in China at a big banquet in the evening. Everybody's sitting around, everybody's watching me, saying, why don't you start eating? And I'm looking at other people and say, well, what's the problem? I said, well, we've just had the SARS epidemic. We're all very anxious about eating protocols. When people come to our homes, we have to be really careful because some people think it's unhygienic to take food from the middle of the table with your chopsticks. So we're watching you to see what you prefer. And suddenly, everybody started talking about how they really struggle with eating conventions. See, we imagine that all Chinese people know how to use chopsticks. And the stories that came out about, well, we try our best, we were brought up this way, we were brought up that way, people have different... And suddenly, the ice is broken and everybody's talking about the problems with knowing how to eat properly. That's the thread. That's the important thing. Okay, there are dangers. Blocking threads. I'm getting mixed up in my own terminology here. Those migrants. People from different cultures could sit together and share the problem they have with migrants. It looks like a thread, but actually it's sharing prejudice. It's a blocking thread. So we've got to be very careful with these things that we talk about. Threading blocks is even worse. Unconscious, traditional prejudice. People who have ancient views about certain other people in their own societies, perhaps because of patriarchy or whatever. And, we've got to be very careful with these things, because it might look as though people are getting on with each other, but if it descends into the sharing of ancient prejudice, it's pulling somewhere else. And I think that's a problem that I'm struggling with. This global understanding. What is it exactly that we want to share? What are the principles we want to arrive at? Do we have moral views about how people should behave that we can share? I don't know. This is a very complex thing. Very complex indeed. Okay. Therefore, we have to find decentered intercultural threads in third spaces, and I'm referring to the new book that's just about to come out. Let me go on to the next slide and try to explain this. Okay, key terminology. Us-them discourse. Everybody asks what this word essentialist means. It was used a couple of times this morning already. And it suddenly dawned on me that actually it's to do with an us-them discourse. In inverted commas. They are essentially different to us because of their culture. That's the essentialist statement. Essentially different. There's no way we can be the same. There's something absolutely separate about us. And then this takes you, and a number of people have written about this, culture then becomes a euphemism for race. Because it's actually racist to imagine a group here and a group there who are essentially different to each other. That is the root of racism. It's got nothing to do with skin color or whatever. Any group who is put over there and defined as being different to you, that is the basis of racism. And it's called neo-racism because it doesn't sound like it. Okay? So culture becomes a euphemism for race. And this is the problem I have with the definition, because the term culture is used in there as a thing. If you always replace the word culture for the word race, then you begin to see what sort of difficulties you might get into. It's very dangerous. It's very difficult indeed. And it's hard. Okay, the center. These are the structures and grand narratives, which are big stories, that define us by fixity and division. We are different to those people. We have to be, because this is how we can survive. This is a very basic human need. We are different to them. I mean, if you're talking about companies and shops and organizations that are in competition with each other and you're branding your product, that's fine. But if you raise this to the national level, then you get the sort of thing I'm talking about. So it's branding your nation as being different to those people in a superior or inferior way. And a very good example of this, sorry I keep talking about Chinese as an example. I had a Chinese PhD student who was offered a job in Mexico. Fantastic job, incredible salary, and he turned it down. I said, why? He said, because Mexico isn't as good as Britain. He had a hierarchy in his head where he preferred to go. And I challenge everybody in the room. We position ourselves. There's no such thing as talking about culture in a neutral way. We just cannot. Everybody is positioning themselves in some sort of hierarchy. And I remember a long time ago, I was interviewing colleagues in Istanbul. We were sitting right on the Bosphorus. And everything that was east was inferior. Everything that was west was superior. This came out. It was very, very clear. Very, very clear. Even inside Turkey. Yeah. And, you move things. I don't know. It's very, very complex indeed. Okay. It's trying to fix things. Trying to put them in a particular place. Then hybridity. Okay. I'm taking this from Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall. I've been rereading this stuff recently. I used to think hybridity was a bit of a problem because it implied something not being quite anything at all and therefore stuck in between somewhere. And when I reread it, I see it means something quite different. We are all a lot of different things. Okay? And it's the nature of culture everywhere to always be hybrid. This idea of purity is imposed by the center discourse. Yeah. When I was talking to an Italian colleague about Italy and Italian unification, she said, well, actually, there's a big myth that was created by the sense of nationalism, that everybody speaks Italian in exactly the same way. Actually, it's not true. There are all sorts of different things going on. And, complicated. So, we have to break this sense of fixity by pulling ourselves away from trying to categorize everything all the time. And then the third space, this is where normality is sufficiently disturbed to enable us to find decentered threads. That American managing director bringing his mother's cake and putting it on the table, probably one of the best things he did, because it broke the ice, it destroyed the normality, and suddenly people could just be people. It stirs things in a way that pushes people to uncertainty, and the uncertainty brings people together. Of course, that's rather a romantic idea. This is very different to the more essentialist use of third space, which is in between. You're in between two cultures. Now, we're talking about something that can be everywhere all the time for everybody. My grandson going into a tantrum at the dinner table because he doesn't want to eat something. He's in a third space. Poor thing. He's perpetually in a third space. He just doesn't know where he is. Very hard. Okay, and then interculturality is a term that's being used increasingly. Finding ourselves within the cultural lives of others and vice versa. Now this is really, really important. When we travel, the old-fashioned idea is that we've got to try and understand those people and put up with them and work out who they are. No. Tolerance. No. That's leading you to this division again. We're not putting up with people because we don't really like them, but we're going to try and like them. We're going to try and find who we are that we didn't know about ourselves in their world, and vice versa. There's something about standing with this guy in the lift this morning that told me something about myself I haven't thought of before. And I want to try and carry this principle all the way through. And Fred Dervin, who I like what he writes, refuses to pin interculturality down. He says it's political, it's hidden, it's difficult, no one knows exactly what it is. So actually, I'm falling into a trap of trying to define it at all. Okay. Small culture formation on the go. Let's try and see what this actually is. Where, so it's a place. You see, I'm working it out for myself. I've been struggling with this concept for a long time, and I'm beginning to understand what I mean by it. Where we engage with culture every day, wherever we find it. And it's always there. every day, from the beginning of our social lives. We find culture all around us, and we have the ability to do something with it. And very importantly, and this is where this is different to this idea of communities of practice, where there's a sense of normativity, trying to find consensus. Small culture formation can be absolutely full of conflict and destruction. This is not something that automatically makes us feel good. It's transient. We come and go. We join groups and we leave them. We fall out with people. So small culture formation on the go is potentially conflictual. That's the important part of it. Okay. So it becomes a laboratory. It's something you can look at. It's very difficult to, talking about, you meant Swedish culture, British culture, whatever. It's vast. You can't see anything. It's too big. But when you come across a small group of people interacting, you can actually begin to work out what's going on. The small is something you can actually look at. So it becomes your laboratory, the place where you can find out. And I'm put into, because actually the difference between culture and interculture begins to dissolve. And I'm beginning to wonder exactly what the difference is. Because, when I first went to primary school, that was one of the biggest culture shocks I had in my entire life. Going to Iran at the age of 23 was nothing compared to going to primary school for the first time. Absolutely nothing in comparison. I was petrified out of my mind. I spent my entire school career trying to find a way not to be noticed by teachers. This was my small culture formation, trying to be in the background so that nobody would ask me a question. This was my competence that I was developing. How to read what's going on around you so that you can be yourself. Okay, so if we're going to look at what's going on, this is the place where we look. It's pulling from personal cultural trajectories. Okay, why was that guy in the lift? Where had he come from? Where was he going? What's happened in his life to get him into that hotel? I once interviewed a whole load of people about their cultural identity, and nearly all of them talked about personal histories, families, grandparents, and it's amazing how many people have moved from somewhere to somewhere else. These are the things that are close to us. Externalizing and transferring our existing. So, this is where you begin to try to work out what we should be learning about these things. Okay? So, if we can begin to recover what's going on in small culture formation on the go throughout our lives, we can begin to understand how we might get on with life as global citizens. Okay, so trying to remember how we do these things. The politics in grand and personal narratives, which we struggle with every single day. Every day these days, I'm fed up with listening to all these people on every single news item you experience talking about Brexit. And here am I trying to, work out what on earth is going on. It's absolutely destroying. It's awful. But these are the sort of things we have to deal with. Managing self and other. Who am I compared to everybody else? This is a basic task. And how new cultural practices can be carried into our worlds and who we are. When I went to Iran, one of the things that I found strange, because of the stereotypes I had, I thought these people have no sense of privacy. Everybody wants to be together all the time. There's no sense where you can be by yourself. Nobody understands personal space. This is what I thought. This is what I carried with me. into this society. And then people kept saying, "Excuse my back." I thought, what does that mean? And what it meant was, if you're in a group, if you turn your back on someone, you excuse yourself. I thought, this is another way of looking at social space. This is personal space. And now I'm very conscious of how I am with other people in a small space, which I never was before. So by going somewhere else, I learned something which I can then carry into another place. I've become more sensitive about personal social space because of the time I had in a completely different place. And it's like visiting your friends next door when you're a child, or even when you're an adult. You learn something about how to continue your own life by experiencing another family in the house next door that's completely different to yourself. These are the basic abilities we need to somehow build out into a global perspective. The problem is that small culture formation on the go can go either way, because it can be based on the blocks. It can choose to go for the essentialist instead of for the hybridity. So small culture formation on the go can be extremely damaging and push you in the wrong direction. And that's the problem. A bit of theory. First of all, this is what's underpinning all the things I'm talking about. Postmodern revolution. Some people don't like this term, postmodern. This is what I feel about it, and I'm referring particularly to some people that I've read that I like. Grand narratives of nation, language and culture are ideologically constructed. They come from politics. Once you have that firmly... So you can't talk about a culture in a neutral way. The notion of big culture is ideologically constructed. It's created these days through the idea of nation, which is a political construction, which is only quite recent in human history. Okay. Then you get the critical cosmopolitan sociologists who say they're pushing against this idea. Culture is shifting without boundaries. Boundaries are imagined. Okay? And then it gets into the politics. The Western center marginalizes and constructs the rest as though it needs to be educated. And you made reference to this right at the beginning with the business about the Americans wanting to educate the world. That's a prime example. The best way to control is to educate. So we have to educate them and make them civilized. And that is your basic center Western. And in doing that, you ignore how people actually are. And this goes to the Orientalist thesis. We imagine the East to be something different to what it actually is, so that we feel we have to educate it. And this is what people like Stuart Hall talk about, the margins. The people who don't fall into this Western definition are misunderstood. So, we mustn't go with these Western definitions of the other. The stereotype about Chinese society being collectivist is actually a Western construction, because the term collectivism is something which is problematic. Japanese colleague Ryoka Kubota takes the stereotype of East Asian societies and says that discursively it's almost exactly the same as the stereotype for underachieving American school kids. And when I hear my colleagues talking about the problems they have with undergraduate students, it's exactly the same discourse as a problem you have with international students or whatever. They can't think critically, they can't think for themselves, they don't speak out, they don't do this, they don't do that. This is a standard stereotype of underperformance. It's got nothing to do with how people actually are. And we've got to escape from that. And connected with that is cultural relativism. So, they are different to us. They should be different to us. We don't want to make them different. They are separate. They have their values, which we mustn't fiddle with. But if they want to come here, we have to teach them to be like us. And it's our responsibility to make them like us. So, you are doing so well, you've become so westernized. This is one of the worst things you can say to anybody, because it implies that you have nothing at all before you arrived. It's a denial of what people bring with them. Okay. And then methodological nationalism. This is where the idea of nation and culture is always a starting point for research. People talk about the social sciences, always starting with national culture as the prime unit which you're going to investigate. And of course, this is hugely distorting. Okay, now, I'm not going to go into this. This is my grammar of culture. This is my sloppy way of making sense of things. And I'm just going to show it to you because just to say that the idea is that nothing is easy. I constructed it purposefully to be so complicated that nobody could really understand it. Because as soon as you try to fix things, everything begins to go wrong. But that's it. And the only thing is that in the middle, you've got small culture formation. All right, okay. But here, and it does come from the social theory of Max Weber to do with social action, and it comes from C. Wright Mills and blah, 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 blah. Okay, but here is a more recent rationalization of it that I prepared for today. Small culture formation on the go in the center, blocks and threads at the bottom. You can go either way. Center structures is the great Satan, all the stuff you're trying to get away from, and the decentered choices are the things you're trying to get to. So, you're basically trying to arrive here, but all of this stuff is so powerful that it constantly gets in the way. And you trying to make sense of the world is really trying to find a way to push something away and bring something in. So I would say that the idea of global competence exists on the right-hand side, and what's on the left-hand side just gets in the way. And I'm going to look at some of these things in detail, so I'm not going to spend time on that. But, that's the sort of picture. See, there's neoliberalism in there, there's commodification, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so, neoliberal seduction. Another one of these terms I didn't really understand until about 3 or 4 years ago. Everybody was talking about neoliberalism. Then one of my PhD students was working on it, and then I began to understand it. Commodification of concepts to show how well we are doing. Okay, so I've got a little example written down here. Where are we? We are a listening university. Sort of phrase you find in the university, I don't know what you call it, plan of action, whatever. We are a listening university. Absolute rubbish. People think that because they've written it, it's all done. And if they've got 16 bullet points that go underneath it, this is neoliberalism. Thinking you solve the problem by writing it all down and having policies. Okay. So, I'm quite keen on this native, non-native speaker issue. Neo-racist native speakerism. Culturally right native speakers teaching the non-native speaker cultural other how to think and be civilized. This is the voice of the ideology of native speakerism. It's all to do with being fixed, and I'm afraid, I've actually said this, I refuse to review any journal articles where people still use acronyms, because the acronyms fix the concepts in the discourse. And people build their careers on comparing native speakers and non-native speakers without realizing the politics behind it. And so there's a big problem there. And then you think, okay, I want a native speaker to teach my children Russian. Yeah. Actually, not any Russian. Got to look right. Got to fit my image of a Russian. Certainly shouldn't look like something else. You cannot do this. So even the simple, ordinary statement, I want a native speaker to teach, is riddled with racism. Okay. Right. But having native speakers and non-native speakers is very useful in a neoliberal scenario where you're trying to categorize colleagues and give some people more money than others and prefer employing certain types over others. And it also gives you something you can put in your textbooks. Okay, branded and packaged slices of so-called native speaker culture, whatever that is. English language textbooks that take, I don't know, some examples from people having drinks with each other in a coffee bar or whatever. You know, this is British. Yeah. So as soon as you get into this thing, it's so easy to construct these images. And there's a lot been written on how textbooks produce all sorts of reductive images of the foreign other. It also gives language teachers an extra easy specialism. I'm awfully sorry, but there's absolutely no basis at all for saying I'm an expert on British culture because I teach English. Absolute rubbish. And the textbook designers who give students the impression that this is British culture should be, anyway. You know, this is branded slicing up of bits of social life. And people have written about the divisive multiculturalism that comes from this. It's not only foreign language textbooks, primary school textbooks all over the world are full of ridiculous stereotypes of who people are. You know, food and festivals, costumes and so on. Absolutely awful. Okay. And I'm afraid the commodification of intercultural competence and globalism becomes a problem. And, you know, when we think that it is learned only through integration with the target, as soon as I start talking about targets and hosts, I mean, it's well known that this is in the divisive discourse of foreign aid. This is where it all comes from. You can only learn about the culture when you get there, and it has to be nicely defined and staged for accountability. So universities like to be able to say, our students have achieved so many stages in intercultural competence because they followed these courses and we've measured exactly what the learning outcomes should be. This is a neoliberal thing. I'm getting this from my student, Haynes Collins, who wrote his thesis on this, that the way that the university as an institution manipulates the notion of the intercultural to serve a neoliberal purpose. And by manipulating this concept, drives it back to earlier paradigms. As soon as you try to measure things and be accountable for things, I mean, you know, it'd be wonderful to have measurements for global competence, but it's so dangerous. As soon as you've got them, you begin to forget what it actually is, or what it actually might be. And, you know, monopolized only by native speaker institutions. Okay. You're coming here, oh, I don't know, it's awful. The West versus the rest cultural anxiety then leads from this. As soon as you divided these things up, you get the other side. So, increasingly, you read things like, okay, my Muslim students have a big problem because when they learn English, they're learning Western culture, which is in direct contradiction to their religious values, which I don't think is true at all. But this is the impression you get when you begin to divide these things up. So learning another language means learning another culture, and there's the issue, what do you do with your existing culture? Is it gain or is it loss? You see this accounting that gets in the way and starts causing these sorts of problems? Okay. Right. Let's see where this might take us. I'm very, very interested with Karen Rissegger's concept of lingua culture. I read this in one of her articles, and I've been lucky enough to talk to her about it since. And this is the first time, perhaps the only time, I've seen an articulation of this relationship that actually means something to me. And it's just in these two paragraphs. People carry, she's Danish, people carry their Danish language resources with them into new cultural contexts and perhaps put them to use in new ways under new circumstances. For example, when I as a Dane move around the world, I tend to build on my Danish lingua culture. When I speak English, French or German, I therefore contribute to the flow. This to me really, really makes sense because it's to do with interculturality. It's carrying yourself and your background somewhere else, and other languages somehow enrich and transform this process. And that to me is meaningful. So what you get is carrying experience from one language to another and back, working out how the language connects with your own world, and the sociolinguistics of language and society. You begin to increase your knowledge of how language works because you go somewhere else and you see other examples. I think this is really important. It's a bit abstract, but this I find meaningful. The open relationship is clearly there. I don't think I need to go into this. Adichie, in her novel Americana, travels from Nigeria to the United States. She has very strongly in her mind a Nigerian English, which she likes. When she gets there, she is sort of forced to abandon it and adopt American English. But when she stayed there a bit longer and gained more confidence, she goes back to her Nigerian English and uses it in the United States, which is interesting. It isn't a one-way linguistic acculturation. Okay. I'm just thinking about I was lucky enough to be in Damascus before the Civil War began and staying with friends of ours, and a young woman I hadn't met before, she was the daughter of a friend, suddenly came into the living room. She'd just come from the United States. And within the space of an hour, her English changed from being an American freshman student to being a Syrian person, still speaking English beautifully, but all the cultural references changed. The body language changed. Everything changed, but it was still English. And, at home, we use the expression, excuse my back, as I mentioned before. When a guest doesn't arrive, we say their place is empty. You can play with language. And Adichie talks about a Nigerian person in the countryside speaking in English and saying, "How did you come out this morning?" A beautiful way of saying good morning. You know, language can travel. Language can adopt all sorts of cultural experience. Language has this incredible ability to travel absolutely everywhere. And the final thing, one of my colleagues I met last year, an Italian young woman who was learning Japanese, she said, "Japanese characters help me to understand Italian better. And I can find ways of expressing myself in Italian better than I could before because I understand something about Japanese characters." You see this movement backwards and forwards? I'm worried about the time now. Okay. So language is part of the architecture of social life. Society and language are each far bigger than the other. English is bigger than British culture, and British culture is much bigger than English, if there is such a thing as British culture. These are not one-to-one relationships. This is not all that either the society or the language can be. Both the language and the society can be many, many different things, but these things don't necessarily just map onto each other. So, language learning, and I made this up just for today, finding our own linguistic trajectories in the new language. This is the idea of lingua culture. Heightening our understanding of how language works. An entry point into the particular society where the language happens to be used. Okay, English happens to be used in Britain. It's also used in a million other places. Okay. Backwards and forwards transfer of existing linguistic and cultural competence. This idea of moving backwards and forwards, finding experiences, and expanding the world views and repertoires of the people who are learning the language. Okay. I cannot get my wife to agree that speaking Persian is a different cultural experience to speaking English. She denies it absolutely. She just refuses to say that, you know, when you speak Persian, you're enacting a different culture to when you speak English. But there's a richness of cultural and references in one that you don't find in the other. And this is where there's a so, you know, what I lose by losing my Persian, my Farsi, is I'm losing some sort of understanding of something different. But it's not as simple as another culture. It's much, much less simple than that. Okay, finding cosmopolitan third space. Okay, developing broader perspectives about alphabets and orthographies, like the Italian student with her Japanese characters. Developing aesthetic appreciations about language and art. I mean, good heavens. You know, Persian script is an artistic form. You know, this is something to think about. Learning about how language and values interact in deeper universal structure. Okay, it's all a bit wishy-washy, isn't it? Anyway, okay. And then what I'm thinking about here, before I finish, achieving small culture formation on the go in a decentered direction. This is at the core of what we're looking for. Achieving third spaces. But I'm very keen on the notion of cultural studies. I have a colleague at Christ Church who does cultural studies, and he writes about this. Why on earth did we ever get into intercultural communication? We should have done cultural studies instead. Cultural studies is much, much better Because cultural studies looks everywhere at our humanity in a lived understanding of the cultural. It interrogates the power structures that oppress or alienate the cultural creativity of the individual. And I don't know if anybody knows about this, but a pan-European project came to an end recently. My colleagues, Bevan and Borghetti at Bologna University, and lots of colleagues all over Europe, developed a whole load of materials for Erasmus students traveling between different universities, and it's based on cultural studies. It avoids entirely any notion of this culture and that culture. And so, as an example, you see, it stimulates students to go beyond national diversities and enjoy their own and others' multiplicity. It's all about looking at hybridity as something that we all share. And one of the examples is Adichie's video, which is called A Single Story. This Nigerian writer who complains bitterly about how people only have one story about Nigerian people. And this is, what's this got to do with students traveling from France to Italy? It's got everything to do with students traveling from France to Italy. One of my Chinese students said the best way to prepare for going to China to live is to read Jane Austen. Because Jane Austen is a detailed analysis of everyday social life. And that prepares you for understanding Chinese society. This is the sort of thinking that we should be aiming for. Not, let's go to that culture and learn about it. Okay. And for professional groups, there's a massive, good heavens, if you're engineers, you've got there's so much to share which is already there. There's so much. You get two engineers together from the other sides of the world, and they immediately have something to talk about. Yeah. Okay. This is just my PhD students who are Algerian and Malaysian at the moment. They are all researching themselves and different aspects of themselves about how they travel from one place to another and they carry things with them. And, it's absolutely fantastic because they're taking the trajectories all the way from their childhood all the way into the future. And it's really, really important. And, in my recent book, we're talking about how researchers have to interrogate who they are before they can understand anything else, blah, 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 blah. But I want to finish, and so I'm just going to rush to this little... This is the introduction to an Iranian primary school textbook in English. Turtles, very convenient, because they don't have to wear particular clothes in a particular way. They can't be put in prison if they don't dress appropriately. Okay, very important. But they're patient and curious. They take their time in water and land. They never worry about where to stay. Of course, this is a romantic. Who knows what the politics of turtles is all about. This is our romanticization of turtles. Our memories are like their homes on their backs. They carry their culture with them wherever they go, and it's small. But the punchline is they travel to different places. They talk to different people. She tells us about other people's stories, and she tells her own stories that are usually our stories too. So when you travel to the other side of the world, you'll hear stories which are actually very similar to your own stories, if you're prepared to listen in the right sort of way. And I think that's what it's all about. Opening your mind to how people express themselves. Okay. She never got the book published, by the way. Because, and she said, one of my primary school children asked me a question in class. She said, the story I'm going to give you today is about a little girl who went to visit her aunt in South America. And the student said, why does she have an aunt in South America? The answer was, well why not? Why not? Why do we have to explain everything? Work it out for yourself. She says, anyway, okay. All right, and there's my bibliography. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. This is very so deep and so provocative in the way as a teacher of Japanese language, as only a native speaker as my portfolio.
Well,
but anyway, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening. And this is the end of this session. And we are going to move to the other room. And we take our lunch together. So some of us, Natalie, is it okay you just lead the people to the other rooms? And as I say, we started our afternoon session there. So if you have already questions,